Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 23rd, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Ohio and a brand new poll from Emerson College in this state. A pretty high quality pollster that's coming out of the state showing Senator Jon Husted, the Republican appointee, former Lieutenant Governor of Ohio, appointed by Governor Mike DeWine to serve out this Senate seat through the 2026 midterm elections, and will face a matchup likely against former Senator Sherrod Brown with a 6-point lead for the Republican Party going into the early stages of this competitive Senate race. Now, Senator Jon Husted has been in this position for a very short period of time, and yet even with that, Emerson College finds that the polling lead and advantage early on is quite tremendous for him in this race. Now, Sherrod Brown made a decision as of recent to enter into the Senate election in 2026, with a lot of speculation that he might pivot and run for governor or detract from politics entirely. He decided that he was going to run for Senate once more, this time against a relatively low name and low name ID Republican, but someone who wasn't as bad of a candidate as Bernie Moreno. And this ran a lot of speculation early on when Sherrod Brown announced this arguably was the biggest get for Democrats in the Ohio Senate race, because without Sherrod Brown on the ballot, the Senate race would have been a safe Republican hold. And this race itself was never really meant to be competitive. I don't imagine that the GOP knew that Sherrod Brown was going to run for Senate. I think a lot of them were expecting that instead he run for governor in 2026, but shocked us all, decided that he was going to run for Senate. And yet, even with an A-tier candidate like Sherrod Brown, Ohio just still is a red state. And the purpose of this video is to talk in tandem with, conversation of Sherrod Brown being in this position and what it means electorally, but also having that conversation. Is this and was this the right move for Sherrod Brown in 2026 to instead run for Senate rather than run for governor? To give you a bit of context, the 2026 Ohio governor's race is looking a lot like it's going to be Vivek Ramaswamy, who is the big name from the 2024 presidential election, huge proponent of Donald Trump, and had a key role in implementing Doge with Elon Musk in Donald Trump's second administration. He went back to the state of Ohio and decided that he wanted to run for governor in that state. Democrats were hoping that with a strong candidate in opposition to him, someone like Sherrod Brown, that he could be taken down. A governor's race is often easier for an opposition party member to win in that state because voters know that the limits of the governor's mansion are only extend to the state boundaries. There's no national implications. If you're a Republican who might like Sherrod Brown but do want to see Republican policies passed nationwide, chances are you're not voting for him for Senate, but you'd be willing to vote for him for governor. And that was the big argument that Democrats were making, that Sherrod Brown would be able to win over a lot of these voters in a governor election, maybe in a way that he wasn't able to in the past Senate election. Electorally speaking, though, Sherrod Brown has an impressive resume. In the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris in the state of Ohio by a whopping 11 points, larger than his victory over Biden in 2020 and larger than his victory over Clinton in 2016. But in the Senate race, we saw that this is 2022, this is 2024, Bernie Moreno, the Republican, only won by about 4 points. Sherrod Brown lost this race by about 7 points less, outpaced Kamala Harris by 7 points statewide, which showed that Sherrod Brown had a significant number of crossover appeal. Kamala Harris received 2.5 million votes. Sherrod Brown received about 2.7. Nearly 200,000 Trump voters voted for Sherrod Brown. Thinking about that in the 2026 midterms, the argument that I think was made to Chuck Schumer then to Sherrod Brown was that voters in a 2026 national environment will be much more positive in favor of the Democratic Party. But it is very difficult when the circumstances of 2024 are not replicated in 2026 in terms of candidate dynamics. What we've understood about the 2026 race for Senate is that Jon Husted is not an extreme Republican. He's not someone who has been in this position that, Democrats have looked to and said, this is the guy who's way too MAGA and way too out there for Ohio's sake. Voters won't like that. No. Husted is more middle of the road. He was tempered by Governor Mike DeWine, and for all intents and purposes, represents a style of Republican that historically, pre-Trump, had done very well in the state of Ohio. That's just the way things worked. Looking at Husted in 2026, he doesn't have the baggage that Bernie Moreno has. He doesn't have the, negative aspects that have been associated with that style of Republican candidate. In the 2024 race, it was Democrats who wanted Bernie Moreno to win that primary. And arguably, He performed the worst in comparison to what I think other Republicans would have performed by. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that in 2026, Republicans have a strong candidate, which means that voters know that. Sherrod Brown is a strong Democrat, but Ohio is still a red state. This is a state that Donald Trump won by 11 points in the last election. If anything, this is quite impressive for Sherrod Brown, but it's not the numbers that he wants, and it's certainly not the numbers that he needs in order to win. The governor's race, I think, would be a bit more difficult to see. Tim Ryan is the most notable Democrat that could run in this race, and even he lost a Senate race to J.D. Vance in 2022, despite having a fundraising advantage and leading in the polls in every single month up until about mid-September. So, and not to knock that, Ohio was still a red state then. Tim Ryan is a strong candidate, but he's not stronger than Sherrod Brown. And even in the hypothetical data, he loses in this same poll that votes for Houston by 6. Ramaswamy wins by 8. Meaning that there are voters who say, I'm voting Republican for governor, but I'm voting Democrat for Senate because of Sherrod Brown. But that crossover appeal is so limited. It only extends to fragmented portions of the Ohio state population, and it doesn't look like it's enough at this point to springboard Sherrod Brown into victory. But early polls can be wrong. I think that you can find that to be the case, especially Sherrod Brown knows that best, that in 2024, the data had suggested early on that Sherrod Brown was in a strong position against Bernie Moreno. He had led consistently in every data point, constantly up, in some cases by pretty massive margins, and then by the time we reached the final race, the aggregates here had Bernie Moreno ahead, and even though Sherrod Brown outraised Bernie Moreno about 4-1, dark groups and outside groups that spent money on this race outspent Sherrod Brown and did a huge character assassination on him, but one that I think still matters in a race like this. The thing about going from back-to-back elections is that voters still recognize the same attack ads and the same reasons why they didn't vote for you 2 years prior. And even though I agree that the 2026 race will be a radically different national environment than that of 2024, you will find that Ohio itself needs to see a massive swing if Donald Trump won it by 11 in the last election, and Houston, for most purposes, might actually outperform Donald Trump in some areas. Not to say he'd win by 12, that's not the case. With a national environment that's much bluer, he won't. But Houston is still the favorite in the state of Ohio. And what this data suggests is exactly that. Sherrod Brown used to be far more popular. People raved about his constituent services and his ties to the state and how involved and much he fighted for Ohio. And I don't think many people would contend that he did a good job in the U.S. Senate. Rather, whether or not they approve of his democratic style of governance might be a different thing. Sherrod Brown comes into this as the second most popular politician in the state of Ohio. Actually, I would say right now, probably on par with some others, but 44% favorability rating for Sherrod Brown, 42% unfavorable. That's only about a +2 advantage. 14% say they're unsure or never heard of him. That's not a great place to be. He's underpacing Vice President J.D. Vance, and that's not a great job, great position to be in. Donald Trump has a 49% approval rating in the state and 42% disapprove. Those Ohio numbers need to look very, very different for him to even have a shot at winning the Senate race. And so that begs the question. If the Ohio governor's race might have been easier, should Sherrod Brown have just gone for that? Well, that's not a question that really can be answered at this point. But if you want my honest take, I've been adamant from the beginning, I always think it's easier to run for governor than it is for Senate, especially when your state has only been shifting towards the right in recent elections, like Ohio has. I think the big warning sign for Democrats, not even the 2024 election, should have been the 2020 election, when the state of Ohio only shifted by a margin, of 0.09%. You're talking a 0.1% shift in 4 years. When the national environment shifted by about 2.5 points to the left, and other swing states like Georgia shifted about 5, Texas shifted about 3, North Carolina by 2, Pennsylvania by 2, Michigan by 3, Wisconsin by 1.5, Arizona by 4. But Ohio barely shifted. By the time you reach the next cycle, Ohio shifted even more to the right. Thinking about that and thinking about what that tells us and what it tells us now in context is that Ohio, again, to reiterate, is a red state. Donald Trump did well in the state. Bernie Moreno beat Sherrod Brown despite being the fact that Bernie Moreno was a much weaker and lackluster candidate. And now looking at 2026, the data is reinforcing it. But again, data is not everything. If the data was right this early on, Sherrod Brown would be in the U.S. Senate for 6 more years and had been reelected in 2024. In the state of Montana, we've seen it happen too. The data said that it's going to be, early on, Tester, then Tim Sheehy takes that lead and runs away with it, right? Thinking about the 2020 races, thinking about that race with David Perdue, what do we remember? That the regular election, Jon Ossoff, what was he called? A sacrificial lamb. What did the data suggest? That might be the case. You can find that in the early days, I guess this only goes back to 2020, but you'll see that Perdue was leading up until a point where Jon Ossoff took it away, final surge, ended up winning. And that's because 2020 in Georgia had turned into a direction that ended up being quite positive for Jon Ossoff and for the Democratic Party and got him barely across that finish line in the final round, in the first round, keeping David Perdue under 50%. And then in the final runoff is the reason Democrats had a Senate majority after the 2020 elections. So 2026, by no means, Democrats should write it off, but should acknowledge and recognize they are in this position as the underdogs. They're not the favorites like they might have been in years like 2018, when Sherrod Brown was very clearly going to win that Senate race from the very beginning, and did go on to win it by about 6 points. Ohio is a lot trickier today than it was 6 years ago, 8 years ago, however many years ago. I'm losing track of time. And that means that Democrats are going to have to fight for it that much more. And the data tells us, and very really and very bluntly, that Democrats are not in a position where they are on track for a solid victory in Ohio. In fact, Republicans are the favorites today. But Houston being at 50% isn't a great time for the GOP either. He needs to be doing better than that if they want a locked-in and solid case for this state. Because although it starts out as the favorite, as we know in American politics, a lot can change in very short periods of time. And Sherrod Brown, who has run and has the infrastructure of a campaign across the state, could very well be in a position where he replicates that in 2026. And if the national environment does, in fact, get much better for the Democratic Party, then Houston might be at risk. And Sherrod Brown could stand to be the only Democrat that is capable of taking him down, but even he may not be able to do so. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.